The golden autumn sun cast long shadows across the manicured gardens of Highgrove. House's Queen Camilla put the finishing touches on what she hoped would be the social event of the season. For months, she had planned this intimate garden party to celebrate her patronage of several literacy charities, carefully selecting guest lists that included influential donors, beloved authors, and close friends from her pre-royal days. Camilla stood at the French doors of the morning room, watching as staff arranged delicate china teacups on pristine white tablecloths. Crystal champagne flutes sparkled in the afternoon light, and towers of delicate finger sandwiches and petit fours created an elegant display. Everything had to be perfect. This was her first major hosting event since becoming queen, and she felt the weight of expectation pressing down on her shoulders like an invisible crown. The guest list included some of Britain's most celebrated literary figures, including best-selling novelist Jojo Moyes and poet laureate Simon Armitage. Local dignitaries from Gloucestershire had also received coveted invitations, along with longtime friends who had supported Camilla through her journey from private citizen to royal consort. She had personally written many of the invitations, adding handwritten notes that made each guest feel specially chosen. As 3 o'clock approached, Camilla retreated to her private dressing room, where her lady-in-waiting helped her into an elegant powder blue ensemble by one of her favorite designers. The outfit was carefully chosen to strike the perfect balance between approachable and regal, with a matching hat adorned with subtle feathers that caught the light beautifully. Her jewelry was understated yet significant, pearls that had belonged to the late Queen Mother, a gesture that symbolized continuity and respect for royal tradition. The first guests began arriving promptly at 3:30, their cars winding up the tree-lined drive to the historic estate. Camilla greeted each arrival personally, a warm smile and genuine interest in their work, immediately putting everyone at ease. The atmosphere was relaxed and intimate, exactly as she had envisioned. Conversations flowed as naturally as the champagne, with guests discussing upcoming literary projects and sharing amusing anecdotes about their writing processes. By 4 o'clock, the party was in full swing. The autumn air was crisp but pleasant, and many guests had ventured into the gardens to admire the spectacular seasonal displays. Camilla moved gracefully between groups, ensuring everyone felt included and valued. She was particularly pleased to see how well the different social circles were mixing, watching a celebrated children's author deep in conversation with a local library volunteer filled her with satisfaction. Catering staff moved discreetly among the guests, ensuring glasses remained filled and that the delicate canapes were constantly replenished. Classical music played softly in the background, provided by a string quartet positioned near the ornamental fountain. Everything was proceeding exactly according to plan, and Camilla allowed herself a moment of quiet pride as she surveyed the scene from beneath an ancient oak tree. However, just as she was beginning to truly relax and enjoy her own party, one of her private secretaries approached with an expression that immediately caught her attention. The young woman's face was carefully neutral, but Camilla had enough experience reading diplomatic expressions to sense that something unexpected was developing. The secretary leaned in close, speaking in the discreet whisper that all palace staff had perfected. The message was brief, but significant enough to cause Camilla's champagne flute to pause halfway to her lips. Princess Anne, who had not been included on the guest list due to a scheduling conflict with her own royal engagements, had just arrived at the front gates of Highgrove House. What made this development particularly intriguing was that Anne hadn't come alone. According to the security team's initial report, she had arrived in a convoy of 3 vehicles, suggesting a considerably larger entourage than would be typical for an impromptu social visit. The Princess Royal was known for her no-nonsense approach to royal duties and her preference for practical efficiency over elaborate ceremony, making this unexpectedly grand arrival all the more puzzling. Camilla excused herself from her conversation with a prominent book publisher and walked briskly toward the house, her mind racing through possible explanations for Anne's surprise appearance. The two women had maintained a cordial but somewhat distant relationship since Camilla's marriage to King Charles, with their interactions generally limited to formal royal functions and family gatherings. As she reached the main entrance hall, Camilla could hear the sound of multiple car doors closing in quick succession, followed by the measured footsteps of what sounded like a substantial group approaching the front door. Through the tall windows flanking the entrance, she caught glimpses of movement that suggested this was indeed more than a casual visit from her sister-in-law. The heavy oak front door of Highgrove House swung open with a ceremonial flourish that seemed to announce something far more significant than a simple family visit. Princess Anne stepped across the threshold with her characteristic confident stride. But what followed her entrance was anything but typical. Behind the Princess Royal came a carefully orchestrated procession that would have been impressive at any state function, let alone an intimate garden party. First came Anne's personal protection officers, their practiced eyes immediately scanning the entrance hall and adjacent rooms. They were followed by her private secretary, a distinguished woman in her 50s who carried herself with the quiet authority that came from decades of managing royal schedules and diplomatic situations. Next appeared the princess's lady-in-waiting, along with 2 additional staff members whose precise roles were unclear, but whose presence added to the growing sense of formality. What truly caught Camilla's attention, however, was the arrival of several individuals she immediately recognized as senior members of various charitable organizations. These were not casual acquaintances of Princess Anne, but rather the chairpersons and chief executives of major British charities with whom the princess had been working for years. Their presence suggested this visit had been planned with considerably more forethought than the timing would indicate. Anne herself was dressed impeccably, in a navy ensemble that managed to be both practical and elegant. With her signature hairstyle perfectly arranged despite the journey, her jewelry was substantial but appropriate, a pearl necklace that had been a gift from her late mother, paired with diamond earrings that caught the afternoon light streaming through the tall windows. Everything about her appearance suggested this was not a spontaneous social call. Camilla moved forward to greet her unexpected guests, her years of diplomatic training helping her maintain perfect composure despite her growing confusion about the situation. Anne's greeting was warm but formal, with the kind of precise royal protocol that left no room for casual interpretation. The embrace they shared was perfectly measured, long enough to demonstrate family affection, brief enough to maintain appropriate dignity as the greetings continued. It became clear that Anne had brought with her the leadership of 3 major charities focused on rural development, agricultural education, and sustainable farming practices. These were causes close to the princess's heart, areas where she had invested decades of personal commitment and expertise. The timing of their arrival, coinciding with Camilla's literary-focused gathering, created an interesting juxtaposition of royal priorities and interests. Anne's private secretary approached Camilla with a carefully prepared explanation for their arrival. According to the official version of events, there had been a last-minute change in the princess's schedule that had freed up her afternoon, allowing her to personally introduce these charity leaders to Queen Camilla. The suggestion was that this had been planned as a brief courtesy call that would not interfere with the ongoing garden party, however. Several details about the arrival suggested a more complex situation. The charity representatives had clearly been prepared for this visit, carrying professionally bound presentations and wearing their finest formal attire. Their knowledge of Camilla's current charitable interests and ongoing royal projects was impressively detailed, suggesting considerable advanced preparation rather than a spontaneous meeting. Moreover, Anne's demeanor carried a subtle energy that experienced royal watchers would have immediately recognized. This was the Princess Royal in full professional mode, executing what appeared to be a carefully planned initiative with the precision and confidence that had made her one of the most effective working royals of her generation. The garden party. Guests had begun to notice the unusual level of activity around the main house. Several prominent authors and local dignitaries had positioned themselves near windows and doorways, their curiosity piqued by the obvious arrival of someone significant. The string quartet continued playing, but conversations had become more animated as guests speculated about the identity of the unexpected visitors. Camilla found herself in the delicate position of managing 2 separate events simultaneously. Her carefully planned intimate gathering was continuing in the gardens, But the main house had suddenly become the setting for what appeared to be an impromptu but highly significant charitable summit. The challenge was maintaining the relaxed atmosphere of her original party while appropriately acknowledging the importance of Anne's unexpected initiative, as if sensing the complexity of the situation. Anne suggested that perhaps the charity representatives could be briefly introduced to some of Camilla's guests, particularly those with connections to educational or rural causes. This proposal had the elegant simplicity that characterized the Princess Royal's approach to solving complicated situations, but it also had the potential to fundamentally change the nature of Camilla's carefully orchestrated afternoon. The moment had arrived for a decision that would determine whether this surprise visit would enhance the garden party or overshadow it entirely. Camilla could feel the attention of both groups of guests focusing on her response, waiting to see how the Queen would handle this unexpected diplomatic challenge. The afternoon sun continued to stream through the windows. The atmosphere had shifted from relaxed celebration to something altogether more complex and potentially consequential. The decision point that had seemed so manageable moments earlier suddenly crystallized into something far more complex when Princess Anne made her next move. Rather than waiting for Camilla's response about introducing the charity representatives, Anne simply began walking toward the garden doors with the confident assumption that her suggestion had been accepted. The charity leaders followed her lead, creating a small procession that moved with royal determination toward the ongoing party. Camilla found herself in the unprecedented position of following rather than leading in her own home. The sensation was subtle but unmistakable, and she realized that Anne had effectively taken control of the afternoon's agenda. With a masterful display of royal initiative, there was nothing overtly challenging about the Princess Royal's actions, but the effect was to transform what had been Camilla's intimate literary gathering into something altogether different. As the group emerged onto the terrace overlooking the gardens, the reaction from the original party guests was immediate and electric. Conversations paused mid-sentence as heads turned toward the unexpected arrivals. The string quartet, well-trained in reading social situations, instinctively increased their volume to provide a musical backdrop for whatever was about to unfold. Anne moved through the gathering with the practiced efficiency that had made her legendary among royal staff and charity workers alike. She seemed to possess an instinctive ability to identify the most influential guests and engage them in conversations that immediately captured their attention. Within minutes, she had connected the head of a rural education charity with a best-selling author who had written extensively about countryside communities. The transformation was remarkable to witness. What had been separate conversations about literature and local interests suddenly became animated discussions about educational outreach, rural literacy programs, and the role of storytelling in preserving agricultural traditions. Anne's charity representatives found themselves surrounded by interested parties, their carefully prepared presentations suddenly becoming the focal point of impromptu working groups. Camilla watched this development with mixed emotions. On one hand, she could appreciate the genuine enthusiasm that Anne's initiative had generated among her guests. The conversations were more dynamic and purposeful than they had been during the earlier, more purely social phase of the party. Several connections were being made that could potentially lead to meaningful collaborative projects. However, the feeling of having lost control over her own event was impossible to ignore. The carefully planned atmosphere of elegant leisure had been replaced by something that resembled a high-level charitable summit. Her role had shifted from gracious hostess to somewhat secondary participant in what was now clearly Princess Anne's show. The Princess Royal's timing proved to be impeccable in ways that seemed almost too convenient to be entirely coincidental. She had arrived just as Camilla's party was reaching its peak, ensuring maximum exposure for her charitable initiatives. The presence of influential guests provided an ideal audience for the rural development presentations, while the relaxed garden setting made the serious discussions feel more approachable and engaging. Anne's private secretary moved discreetly among the groups, taking notes and collecting contact information with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a well-rehearsed plan. The suggestion that this had been a spontaneous visit was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, particularly given the sophisticated coordination required to bring together charity leaders from different organizations on what was supposedly short notice. The original party guests seemed energized rather than annoyed by the unexpected turn of events. Many of them had limited previous exposure to the operational aspects of major charities, and they found themselves genuinely interested in learning about rural education challenges and sustainable farming initiatives. The authors, in particular, were intrigued by the storytelling opportunities these causes might provide. Camilla's catering staff adapted admirably to the changed circumstances, quickly arranging additional seating areas and ensuring that the new arrivals were properly served. The afternoon had taken on a festival-like atmosphere, with multiple conversations happening simultaneously and guests moving freely between different interest groups. As the sun began to shift toward late afternoon, it became clear that Anne's intervention had succeeded beyond what anyone might have reasonably expected. The charity representatives had made more meaningful connections in 2 hours than they typically managed in months of traditional fundraising approaches. The original party guests had discovered new causes that genuinely excited them, and several preliminary commitments for future collaboration had already been discussed. Yet beneath this surface success, subtle tensions were beginning to emerge. Some of Camilla's closest friends had noticed her increasingly strained smile and were beginning to understand that their hostess was not entirely pleased with how her carefully planned event had been transformed. The palace staff, trained to read royal moods with precision, were also becoming aware that the afternoon's dynamics had shifted in ways that might have longer-term implications. The moment that would define the remainder of the afternoon was approaching as Anne prepared to make what appeared to be some kind of formal announcement to the assembled guests. The Princess Royal positioned herself near the ornamental fountain, where the acoustics would ensure her words carried clearly across the garden, requested the attention of everyone present. Princess Anne's voice carried with the authority of someone accustomed to addressing crowds. Cutting through the garden party chatter with effortless command, the string quartet ceased playing without needing instruction, and conversations faded as guests turned their attention toward the fountain where she stood. The autumn light created a natural spotlight effect, positioning Anne as the undisputed center of attention in what had begun as Camilla's intimate gathering. The Princess Royal began by expressing her gratitude to Queen Camilla for the opportunity to share information about rural charitable initiatives with such a distinguished gathering. Her words were perfectly diplomatic, but the underlying message was unmistakable, and was positioning herself as the primary driver of the afternoon's activities. With Camilla cast in the supporting role of gracious facilitator, what followed was a masterful presentation that demonstrated why Princess Anne had earned such respect throughout the SCE. She spoke with genuine passion about the challenges facing rural communities, the importance of agricultural education, and the role that influential supporters could play in addressing these issues. Her knowledge was detailed and current, reflecting years of hands-on involvement rather than ceremonial oversight. The charity representatives she had brought with her were introduced not as afterthoughts, but as essential partners in addressing some of Britain's most pressing rural challenges. Each organization was given a moment to present their most compelling current projects, with Anne providing context that helped the literary and social guests understand how they might contribute to meaningful solutions. As the presentations continued, it became increasingly clear that this had been planned as more than a simple introduction session. Anne was effectively launching a coordinated campaign to recruit new supporters from among Camilla's carefully curated guest list. The approach was sophisticated and well executed, taking advantage of the relaxed garden party atmosphere to make serious charitable appeals feel like natural conversations among friends. Camilla found herself in an extraordinary position of watching her own guests being systematically recruited for causes she had not chosen to promote. The literary focus of her original event had been completely overwhelmed by agricultural and rural themes that, while worthy, had never been central to her own charitable interests. Her role had been reduced to nodding appreciatively while commanded the attention of everyone present. The transformation was so complete that several guests who had arrived, expecting to discuss books and literacy, found themselves signing up to visit working farms and participate in rural education initiatives. The head of a major publishing house was deep in conversation about funding mobile libraries for remote agricultural communities. A celebrated novelist was exploring the possibility of writer-in-residence programs for farming families. Anne's private secretary had produced a selection of professionally designed pledge cards and commitment forms that allowed interested guests to indicate specific ways they might like to become involved with the various charitable initiatives. The level of organization required for such materials suggested weeks, if not months, of advanced planning rather than the spontaneous visit that had been described. The success of Anne's approach was undeniable from a charitable perspective. More concrete commitments had been made in a single afternoon than many organizations typically secured in an entire fundraising season. The combination of social pressure, genuine enthusiasm, and expert presentation had created an environment where saying no felt almost impossible. However, the personal dynamics between the two royal women were becoming increasingly strained beneath the surface politeness that royal protocol demanded. Camilla's friends and staff could see the tension in her carefully maintained smile and the slight stiffness in her posture as she watched her event being transformed into something entirely different from what she had envisioned. The situation reached a particularly delicate moment when Anne suggested that Camilla herself might like to become more actively involved in rural charitable work, perhaps by accepting patronage of one of the organizations represented. The suggestion was made publicly in front of all the guests, creating a situation where declining would appear unsupportive of worthwhile causes. Camilla's response was a masterclass in diplomatic deflection. She expressed admiration for the important work being described while noting her existing charitable commitments and the importance of each royal family member focusing on their particular areas of expertise. Her words were gracious but firm, establishing boundaries that had been tested throughout the afternoon. The exchange highlighted the fundamental difference in approach between the two women. Anne's style was direct and results-oriented, focused on achieving specific charitable outcomes regardless of social conventions. Camilla preferred a more traditional approach that emphasized relationship building and gradual development of mutual interests rather than immediate recruitment of supporters. As the afternoon progressed toward early evening, it became clear that Anne's initiative had achieved everything she could reasonably have hoped for. The charity representatives had exceeded their most optimistic projections for new supporter engagement. The original party guests had been exposed to causes they had never previously considered. Most importantly, the Princess Royal had demonstrated her continued relevance and effectiveness within the royal charitable landscape, yet the cost of this success was becoming apparent in the subtle changes in atmosphere among those who understood the complex dynamics at play. Camilla's closest friends were beginning to recognize that their hostess had been outmaneuvered by someone operating with superior preparation and tactical advantage. The afternoon had become a demonstration of royal hierarchy and charitable influence that extended far beyond simple fundraising activities. The late afternoon sun cast longer shadows across the Highgrove Gardens as the reality of what had transpired began to settle over the transformed gathering. What had started as Queen Camilla's carefully orchestrated literary salon had become Princess Anne's charitable recruitment drive, complete with signed pledges, scheduled farm visits, and commitments that would extend far beyond the original scope of the afternoon's activities. The success of Anne's initiative was impossible to deny, but the method of its execution had created undercurrents of tension that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Several of Camilla's longtime friends had begun to recognize that their hostess had been systematically outmaneuvered, and their protective instincts were starting to surface in subtle but meaningful ways. Lady Morrison, a close friend who had known Camilla since before her royal marriage, found an opportunity to approach Princess Anne near the ornamental rose garden. Her conversation was perfectly polite, but carried an undertone that experienced social observers would have immediately recognized as significant. She complimented the Princess Royal on her passionate advocacy while gently noting how much work Camilla had invested in planning her original literary focus for the afternoon. Anne's response demonstrated the political acuity that had made her such an effective royal representative for decades. She acknowledged Camilla's efforts while expressing surprise that anyone might view the charitable presentations as competing with rather than enhancing the afternoon's activities. Her tone suggested genuine bewilderment at any interpretation of her actions as inappropriate or inexproprious. This exchange was observed by several other guests, including some who had connections to both women through various royal and charitable networks. The palace staff, trained to maintain absolute discretion while remaining acutely aware of developing situations, began making subtle adjustments to their service approach that reflected their understanding of the changing dynamics. Meanwhile, Camilla found herself engaged in increasingly complex conversations about charitable commitments she had never intended to make. The guests who had been recruited for rural initiatives naturally assumed that their hostess would be closely involved in the causes they had just embraced. Explaining her limited involvement without appearing unsympathetic to worthwhile work required diplomatic skills that were being tested too. Their limits, the situation became more complicated when several guests began expressing enthusiasm for organizing follow-up events that would combine literary themes with rural charitable work. The suggestions were well-intentioned and potentially valuable, but they represented a fundamental alteration of Camilla's carefully developed charitable profile. Her established focus on literacy and domestic violence issues was being diluted by agricultural themes she had never chosen to champion. Princess Anne, perhaps sensing the growing tension, began preparing for what appeared to be a strategic withdrawal. Her private secretary started the discreet process of collecting contact information and confirming follow-up commitments. While the charity representatives gathered their materials and prepared to depart, the timing suggested someone who understood exactly when to conclude a successful operation. However, Anne's exit strategy included one final element that would ensure the afternoon's impact extended well beyond the immediate gathering. She announced plans for a follow-up reception at her own residence, Gatcombe Park, where the newly recruited supporters could tour working agricultural facilities and meet additional charity representatives. The invitation was extended to all of Camilla's guests, effectively continuing the recruitment process beyond the boundaries of the current event. This announcement created a particularly delicate situation for Camilla. Declining to attend would appear unsupportive of charitable work that her own guests had enthusiastically embraced. However, attending would further cement her association with causes that had never been central to her royal identity. The invitation was perfectly crafted to make refusal difficult while ensuring continued momentum for Anne's initiatives. The charity representatives began their departures with expressions of gratitude that emphasized Anne's role in creating the opportunity for such successful outreach. Their comments, while acknowledging Camilla's hospitality, clearly positioned the Princess Royal as the driving force behind the afternoon's charitable achievements. The distinction was subtle but unmistakable to anyone familiar with royal protocol and charitable fundraising. As the additional vehicles began departing, the remaining guests found themselves in the unusual position of attending what felt like two different events simultaneously. Those who had been primarily interested in the original literary focus were somewhat bewildered by the afternoon's evolution, while others had become genuinely excited about their new rural charitable commitments. Camilla's staff faced the challenge of managing a conclusion to an event that had fundamentally changed character during its progression. The catering requirements had evolved throughout the afternoon, the guest dynamics had shifted multiple times, and the hostess had been placed in an increasingly secondary role despite remaining technically in charge of her own gathering. The photographers, who had been discreetly documenting the event for official royal records, had captured an afternoon that would require careful editing to present a coherent narrative. The images told the story of what appeared to be a highly successful charitable initiative. But the context and control dynamics were far more complex than would be apparent from official documentation. As the sun continued its descent toward the horizon, the remaining guests began to sense that they were witnessing the conclusion of something more significant than a simple garden party. The afternoon had become a demonstration of royal influence, charitable effectiveness, and personal dynamics that would likely be discussed and analyzed long after the last champagne glass had been cleared away. The final act of Princess Anne's remarkable afternoon began with her preparation to depart Highgrove House. But even this conclusion was orchestrated with the same strategic precision that had characterized her entire visit. Rather than simply saying goodbye and leaving, Anne took the opportunity to address the remaining guests one final time. Positioning herself near the main terrace where her words would carry clearly across the garden, her closing remarks were a masterpiece of diplomatic language that managed to thank Camilla for her hospitality while simultaneously claiming credit for the afternoon's charitable achievements. She spoke about the importance of royal family members supporting each other's initiatives and expressed confidence that the connections made during the afternoon would lead to meaningful long-term partnerships between the literary community and rural charitable organizations. The subtext was unmistakable. To anyone familiar with royal protocol, Anne was publicly establishing herself as the architect of a successful charitable networking event. While graciously acknowledging Camilla's role as hostess, the distinction was subtle but significant, positioning Anne as the active agent of change while relegating Camilla to the more passive role of providing venue and guests. As Anne moved through the remaining guests, offering individual farewells, she maintained the same confident energy that had characterized her entire visit. Her conversations included specific follow-up commitments and scheduling, details that reinforced the sense that this had been a working event rather than a social gathering. Each interaction strengthened the impression that significant business had been accomplished. The departure itself was as carefully staged as the arrival had been. Anne's convoy reassembled with military precision, creating a visual reminder of the scale and importance of her visit. The charity representatives were escorted to their vehicles with obvious respect and attention, emphasizing their significance as partners in important work rather than mere guests at a social function. Camilla found herself standing at the entrance to Highgrove House, waving goodbye to visitors who had transformed her intimate literary gathering into something entirely different. The experience of watching her own event being systematically redirected had been both impressive and deeply unsettling. She could appreciate Anne's charitable effectiveness while simultaneously feeling that her own authority as hostess had been skillfully undermined. Remaining guests observed this departure with the fascination that comes from witnessing expert political maneuvering in action. Many of them had spent their careers in fields where influence and networking were essential skills, and they recognized the sophistication of what they had just experienced. Anne had achieved remarkable charitable outcomes while maintaining perfect royal protocol throughout the process. As the convoy disappeared down the tree-lined drive, the atmosphere at Highgrove began to shift back towards something resembling a normal social gathering. However, the conversations that resumed were fundamentally different from those that had characterized the earlier part of the afternoon. Guests found themselves discussing rural charitable work with the same enthusiasm they had previously reserved for literary topics. The transformation was so complete that several guests commented on how educational and inspiring the afternoon had been, apparently unaware that the educational aspects had been entirely unplanned additions to Camilla's original concept. Their enthusiasm was genuine, and their charitable commitments were meaningful. But the context had been fundamentally altered without their full understanding of the dynamics at play. Camilla's closest friends remained for some time after the other guests had departed, providing moral support and helping to process what had been an extraordinary afternoon. Their conversations were careful and diplomatic, but the underlying message was clear: they had witnessed something remarkable that had implications extending far beyond charitable fundraising. the palace staff began the process of clearing up what had effectively been two different events held simultaneously in the same location. The original garden party preparations were mixed with materials from impromptu charitable presentations, creating a physical reminder of how completely the afternoon's character had evolved. Their efficiency in managing these complex logistics demonstrated the adaptability that made royal households function effectively under unexpected circumstances. As evening approached, Camilla found herself in her private sitting room reviewing the afternoon's events with her private secretary. The charitable outcomes had been genuinely impressive, with concrete commitments that would benefit important causes. However, the personal and political implications were more complex and would require careful consideration. In planning future events, the afternoon had demonstrated Princess Anne's continued effectiveness as a working royal and her ability to generate meaningful charitable support. Even under challenging circumstances, it had also revealed the potential for royal family dynamics to create competition rather than collaboration, particularly when different approaches to charitable work intersected in unexpected ways. The ultimate assessment of the afternoon would depend on perspective. From a charitable standpoint, Anne's intervention had been remarkably successful, generating more concrete support than anyone could reasonably have expected. From a personal relationship standpoint, the afternoon had highlighted tensions and territorial issues that would likely influence future interactions between the two royal women. The garden party that had begun as Camilla's celebration of literary achievement had ended as a demonstration of Anne's charitable influence and strategic capabilities. The transformation had been so skillful and diplomatically executed that criticism would be difficult to justify. Yet the impact on personal relationships and future royal dynamics was likely to be significant and long-lasting.